Good afternoon. Today is Tuesday, April the 6th, and today I would like to finish our unit on World War One. And so, yes, today we're just cleaning up. We will have seen several of the YouTube videos about the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918, which killed over 100 million people worldwide. But since it came on the heels of World War One, it got very little notice. Then another one on the Treaty of Versailles, which was, called one of the greatest blunders of the 20th century. And another one that I found particularly interesting about the course of the war here in the United States, and that was the anti-German prejudice that occurred. I mean, it really did. There was a serious prejudice, serious discrimination, serious sentiment of hatred for Germans who lived in this country. And considering the fact that 25% of the population of this country are of German ethnicity, that was a thing. But we'll get to that in a second. So let's begin, shall we? So World War One was a total war. What that means, it means that the countries involved just allocated all of their resources, as in human resources, physical resources, monetary resources, but also even resources of the spirit, propaganda campaign. I mean, for example, as we're going to see, in much of the country, the singing of the song Silent Night, the Christmas song Silent Night, was banned. Why? Because it was a song of German origin. Now, note that a total war is where the battlefield makes no distinctions between civilians and soldiers. Yep. And it didn't, because one of the things about World War One was there were actually more civilian casualties, more dead civilians than there were dead soldiers. And that statistic, that was by design. They intended it to be that way. The idea being, kill your enemy's mom, and they don't want to fight anymore. So, what was the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918? Well, like I said about that film, the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918, also called the Spanish flu. The term Spanish flu, by the way, was actually a racist name for it. Most people don't know about the flu pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. Pardon me, guys. Was that it did not actually originate in Spain. No, the Spanish flu actually began in Iowa, as in the state of Iowa. It began on a poultry farm, and some young farmer, and I remember the documentary, they even named him, had gotten the flu, and then he got recruited to go to World War One. He took the flu with him, and he went to a United States Army training camp, spread the flu there. Then he got on board a ship, a large passenger ship, and those passenger ships that they would send soldiers to Europe in were packed like cans of sardines. And so the flu spread all through that ship. And then by the time the ship got to Europe, soldiers got off, the flu then went to the front lines. And from the front lines, it went to all the other countries. So, that's why it ended up killing over 100 million people between 1918 and 1920. So why was it called the Spanish flu? Well, you have to remember that during World War One, all the countries were looking for any possible edge that they could find, and also trying to keep any kind of information that might be encouraging to the enemy away from the enemy. One of those bits of information, they didn't want to go reporting in newspapers and official statistics, just how many people were dying of this flu. Because it might show weakness, they thought. And so all of the countries involved in World War One, not just the United States, but also Britain, France, Germany, none of them made mention of it in their newspapers. None of them made mention of it in any of their communiques, press releases. But then the flu made its way to Spain. Spain was not involved in World War I, and so Spain began producing reports in its newspapers of this flu that was killing people. Therefore, it became known as the Spanish flu. Anyway, as it says there, continuing on, economies of many countries became completely geared towards the war effort and little nothing else. And you have your first examples of war rationing of things like not just gasoline or metals or things like that, but also sugar, meat. You had meatless Fridays, meatless weeks in some places where there was no meat available, and because it went to the war effort. And then there was war censorship, meaning that you couldn't say certain things that were favorable to the enemy. You could not criticize the government. Newspapers actually would get shut down if they reported on news that the governments might find compromising. And so, yes, and the song Silent Night was banned because it's a German song. Women worked in this war like they'd never worked before. Not like they're going to work in World War II, mind you. But more women went to the factories and began taking on jobs. So Russia withdrew from the war due to its own failures and a near mutiny in the government. By 1917, 5.5 million soldiers had been killed or wounded. And then in November 1917, a coup by a man named Vladimir Ilyanovich Lenin seized power from the Provisional Democratic Government. When Russia withdrew, the Germans threw everything they had into a desperate counterattack on the Western Front, hoping to gain some sort of compromised peace or a victory before the Americans showed up in force. The attack, though successful in gaining some territory, came at a high price for the Germans in terms of German soldiers. I mean, I remember we watched the last scenes of All Quiet on the Western Front, where Cat gets killed. You know, they were, and also the soldiers were not men anymore; they were boys. And he was talking about how they didn't have any food. They were talking about how the cannon, the barrels were worn down. You know, the German army just couldn't carry on. As it said there, the German army could not afford these kinds of losses and were weakening. Then, with the United States kicking in about 140,000 new soldiers, the Allies counterattacked, driving the Germans back. In July of 1918, the Americans landed 2 million more soldiers, and things for the Germans went from bad to worse. First the Bulgarians, then the Ottoman Turks surrendered. But in Germany, where the people had been told all along that the war was going great, remember that scene from All Quiet on the Western Front where everybody would ask Paul Bomber, "How's it going there? Is it great, right? You guys are doing great, right?" You know, the German people had not been told. And, you know, people will suffer for a just cause. People will suffer, you know, great lengths if they believe their cause is just, and also if they believe that they're being told the truth. But if they find out that they've been lied to, the support of a people in time of war will evaporate like water on a hot day. And so, yeah, on November 9th, 1918, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, stepped down, and a new government will ask for terms of peace. Then on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, November the 11th, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the armistice was signed, ending the war, and Paul Baumer, as you remember, got shot in the head. World War I was something the world had never seen before, but unfortunately would see again in less than 2 decades. Who won the war? Answer: you know, my students always have difficulty with this. And I say, who won the war? No country won the war. And then you start naming countries. 3 entities won the war. 1, people always win wars, munitions dealers. In other words, people who sell armaments. They won World War I big time. The ironic thing was that most of these armament dealers were Americans. Yeah, some big fortunes were made in the United States during World War One. Two, colonies that had no chance of ever gaining independence began to get a foothold. Much of the Middle East became independent as a result of World War One. But yeah, colonials, it gave them a foothold, a step up towards independence. And finally, the one group that really won the war, because the war opened a door for these guys that would have never been opened, communists. Yeah, the Communist Party, the communists would have never came to power without the war ending the czar. You know, just weren't that powerful. The communists were just not that. There weren't that many of them. 8.5 million soldiers in World War I died outright, with another 21 million being wounded physically. Not to mention the number who brought home the scars of war that you can't see: post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock, alcoholism, all kind of things. 10 million civilians died. And like I said, that was the first time that had ever happened, where there were more civilians dying than there were soldiers. The cost of the war, approximately $338 billion, which, today that doesn't seem like a lot, but in 1918, that was a big chunk of money. This war also destroyed 1/4, 25% of all French farmland. This war ended the age of Europe, the age of colonialism, because the European powers were now destabilized. As it says there, winning a war is only half the battle. It is just as important, if not more important, to win the peace. The Allies did not win the peace, not at all. And we saw in that video, we'll probably see it right now. Yeah, we'll see it right now. Because the Allies didn't win the peace, because they're basically fighting the same war again against the same people in some 20 years. Who were the big three? Well, you've seen a picture of them. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau of France. And like I said, they're in the video. Woodrow Wilson, he was an interesting study in the peace process. His only prior political appointment had been as the governor, has been and then he served as president of Yale. Yeah, he was governor of New Jersey. He was an idealist, which, is a nice thing to be unless you're a politician, because he was slightly naive. He actually believed that when people would tell him something, that they'd be honest. However, Woodrow Wilson came to the peace treaty, the peace conference. He was the most prepared person there. He brought with him a plan for peace called the 14 points. And that's. Oh, wait, did you know that Woodrow Wilson was the model they used for the Planters peanut guy? You ever seen the Planters peanut guy? He's just a big peanut, and he has the top hat, and he has the turtle shell glasses. Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, they used him as the model. That's not a lie. So, his plan for peace. What were his plan for peace? I'm not going to make you learn all 14, but let's see if we can get the main parts. Okay. 2, freedom of trade and navigation. Should be self-explanatory enough. 3, self-determination. You say, what does that mean? It means that each ethnic group, whether they be Poles or Czechs or Slovaks or Slovenes or Hungarians or Ukrainians or Italians, each group should be ruled. In other words, they should rule themselves. There should be a Poland for Poles, a Czech Republic for Czechs, a Hungary for Hungarians, etc., etc., etc. It's interesting because, when I went to, I'm going to have to pause again. I'm going to pause. Can I pause? Hang on. It's interesting. I was in the Czech Republic in 2018. 2018 marks the 100th anniversary of the Czech Republic. And so I took a train from Krakow in Poland to the Prague in the Czech Republic. And as I got off the train, literally as I exited the train station, I was confronted with that. Now you say, what is that? Let's take a look, shall we? See that? In the middle of Prague, in a very prominent place, there is a giant statue of an American president. Now, that's unusual. And the reason there is a giant statue of President Wilson is because the Czechs, Poles, many people like him, give President Wilson the credit for giving their country a chance to be independent, giving their ethnic group a chance to rule themselves. And so, yeah, statue of President Wilson. Imagine that. So, oh yes, and one more thing. League of Nations. Yeah, what was the League of Nations? The League of Nations was to be an international congress where countries would meet, and instead of going to war over their differences, they would talk them out. Yeah, Wilson was really kind of naive. He just thought that if you gave people a chance to talk, they could work anything out. That democracy would be the best form of government and it would work anywhere. So, as it says there, the Treaty of Versailles was one of the great determiners of history for the next 30 years, but it was not a good treaty. It was dominated by revenge, by the British and French, and the desire to finish off deals that were made during the war by the victors, particularly the British and the French. Its major weakness was that simply it was too strict to be enforced. Now, that might be too hard to understand. Too strict to be enforced. What does that mean? Well, it would be like this. What if, on the first day of school last year, you guys all came in here and I said, okay, here's my rule in class. The first person that makes a sound without permission will be executed right there on the spot. And I produce some kind of weapon to show that I can do it. And so that's pretty hazardous, right? And so for a while, things go okay. Nobody wants to make a sound. And then eventually somebody does. Somebody will, even by accident. So then I, as teacher, have a choice to make. I can either execute that student, which means that I'll be going to jail for the rest of my life, or I can do nothing. Now, what happens if I do nothing? I mean, I don't want to go to jail for the rest of life, but what happens if I do nothing? Answer, everybody's going to be making noises and showing, it's too strict to be enforced. You see? And so, yeah. And not to mention was one thing that was written into the Treaty of Versailles was called Article 231. Article 231 was a part of the Treaty of Versailles that basically said Germany, it was entirely at fault. The war was Germany's fault, and anything that happens to Germany going forward is Germany deserves, and it's their fault. And Germany was not even allowed to be present at the treaty negotiations. They had to sign it. They had to sign the treaty basically without even seeing it, pretty much. and the treaty was very harsh, very strict upon the Germans. So, Woodrow Wilson, as it says there, idealist that he was, often found himself locking horns with the more cynical, but the more experienced George Clemenceau of France, who wanted to punish the Germans, had vowed to do so, while Lloyd George had promised in the last election campaign to squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeaked. 4 empires were dismembered as a result of this war. The Russian Empire, because, the Russians surrendered, they lost tons of territory. The German Empire, for obvious reasons. The Austrian Empire. And finally, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire were all dismantled after World War I. Former holdings of these lands were turned into what were called protectorates, that basically became colonies of the British and French. Ah, yes, the Polish corridor. Let's look at my map. We're going to have to pause again. Let's look at my map. And we're back. Once again, let's look at this map. The Polish corridor. This is Europe in 1914. This is Europe after the Treaty of Versailles. Now, one of the things you notice right away is that they created Poland. And Poland, if you look here, now has an outlet to the sea. Notice the outlet to the sea, though. By the way, this map, I don't like this. This map should be magenta, just the way Germany is, because East Prussia is part of Germany. It wasn't an independent country, it's part of Germany. But this thing right here, the so-called Polish corridor, cuts right through Germany. It was a strip of land given to Poland so that Poland would have an outlet to the sea. It was German land. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It was German land, populated entirely by Germans. The city of Danzig was a very valuable port city and populated by Germans. And so, But also, while we're looking at it, notice how the map changes. From 1914, notice all these new countries that were created. Okay? All right. For what it's worth, the United States Senate never endorsed this treaty, and it was said that Woodrow Wilson caused his own death. He suffered a stroke trying to travel across country on a train to get the population of the United States to accept it. The United States actually signed a separate peace treaty with Germany in 1922. The nations of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and Romania were created out of the former Russian territory. Why did they take Russian territory? Well, Russia dropped out of the war. You can't have the spoils if you drop out of the war. And so, that ends World War I. Tomorrow, which is Wednesday, we're going to watch a bit of a film about World War I. Perhaps you have seen it, perhaps not. But I think you'll like it. Have a good day.